What's up, good people of the world? It is the Big Heavy coming back to you with a conversation about tactical communications. Let's start by getting on some common vernacular ground and discuss what I mean by the word tactical. And what may jump to your mind immediately is some sort of, military application or, getting your band of brothers together to fight the zombie horde and figuring out who's going to, carry the chainsaw and who's going to carry that weird swingy thing with the metal ball and spikes on the end. But I'm using the word tactical in a more general sense. So what I'm talking about is exchanging routine information in a small geographic area. So for you, tactical communications might be that, invading zombie horde. For me, it's, talking to the scouts when I'm out on a backpacking trip and, we have 20 scouts hiking at different paces. And we ultimately end up splitting into a couple or three different groups and need to coordinate amongst the adults with each group in case somebody at the back of the pack has an injury, somebody needs a break, or we just kind of get spread out. It could be, if you and 3 or 4 other families are going on a road trip somewhere and need to communicate between the different vehicles. Maybe you and your partner or your homeboy or homegirl or whatever are rolling around on a road trip in different cars, want to exchange information. Or even if you have a small company that's spread out geographically. So my first job was at an amusement park, and if I was out driving the golf ball picker out in the driving range and some jabroni left the bathroom in the amusement park a mess, I'd get a call on the radio saying clean up on aisle 2 essentially. So all of those are what I would consider tactical communications. And you probably have your own application, you may have your own general purpose idea. Maybe you just want to send the kids out to play in the woods and want a way to get in touch with them. But a few different options here, and probably the first one is the one that's most common, but probably not the most effective, and that's your friendly neighborhood smartphone. In my case, this is an iPhone. What's good about these guys for tactical communications are they're fairly ubiquitous, at least among adults. If you've got small kids, maybe you're a high roller and give them all iPhone XP 1000s or whatever the hell the new model is. In my case, we don't, so that may be a challenge. But they do cover a wide geographic area. I could pretty quickly ring up somebody on the other side of the world with this puppy. They do have some abilities to do diverse and what we might call information-rich communications. So I can send somebody mapping information. I can send them photos. I can get them all kinds of data. All sorts of super cool stuff. The negatives to the smartphone are, number one, it's not very good for short voice communication, which I think is a lot of what's useful in tactical communications. You think of the classic two-way radio, which we're going to talk about in a minute. If I just need to tell you that, hey, I'm taking a left turn to get off at the rest stop when we're on a road trip, it's, I got to ring you up. I got to find out where you are in my contact list. If I want to call you, if I want to text you, I'm sort of doing the one-hander and, potentially crashing my vehicle. And you obviously don't want to do that because it's not very safe and a little bit stupid. And, there's walkie-talkie apps, but then, I'm fiddling with this thing. I'm unlocking it. If I'm wearing a, stupid COVID mask, I got to do all that stuff. And it's just not very effective for being able to communicate short bursts of voice related information, which is, frankly, how humans do most of their communicating. The other negative to these guys, aside from the fact that it's a $1,000 piece of technology equipment, is it's dependent on some sort of infrastructure. So for the most part, it's cellular communications. It might be Wi-Fi if you're sitting in your house, but there's an external party that needs to keep the infrastructure up and running for this thing to work. So, in the event of that hypothetical zombie apocalypse, I don't know if zombies eat cell phone towers, but assuming they do, you're kind of SOL with this guy. From a more pragmatic perspective, maybe you're on a hike in the backcountry, you don't have cell service, you're SOL with this dude again. Not a great option, quite frankly, for that short voice-based communication that I think sort of exemplifies the primary focus for tactical communications. So with that in mind, the next obvious route is radio. And I've got two different radios we're going to talk about here. One is what's colloquially called a ham radio, and another which is a GMRS radio. That stands for General Mobile Radio Service. And speaking generally about two-way radio, the thing that's nice is if I want to send a quick text-based communication, I hold down the transmit button, I say what I need to say, you hear it without any particular challenges. You don't have to unlock it. There's no passcodes, there's no goofiness or anything like that. I can adjust the volume. I can communicate from what's kind of the technical term is point to multi-point. So if I've got 10 of my peeps either on a road trip or out in the woods or, wherever they happen to be, I hold down that transmit button, assuming we're all on the same channel. Everyone hears me. If they need to respond, they can all speak back, and we avoid playing the phone game where I'm either sending text messages to a bunch of people or, I have to call you have to call the other person and that sort of nonsense. So very easy for point to point, very easy for point to multi-point, very easy for those short voice messages. And also no dependency on infrastructure. This guy is a radio, obviously, that's two-way. There's no use of towers. There's no use of external communications. We'll talk a little bit about how you can actually use some external infrastructure to boost the utility of these guys, but it's not necessary. And the negative to that, of course, is I lose some range, whereas my friendly smartphone, I can call somebody in another country with relative ease. With this guy, for the most part, and we'll talk briefly about some exceptions, I have maybe a mile range if I'm out in the ocean where have complete line of sight. Maybe I'm 10 or 15 miles. Forgetting what they say on all the advertisements where up to 20-mile range. These things practically have about a mile range in good conditions. If I'm in deep woods, if I'm on hills and mountains and stuff, it may be a little less than that. If I'm in a urban area, we may be 100 yards apart, but if you're standing on one side of a large building and I'm standing on the other, we're not going to be able to communicate through that building, most likely. So once you've settled on two-way radio for your tactical communications, the next thing is you start to research, and the fork in the road that most people find is, do you go with something that's easy to acquire that doesn't require a license, or do you go more the ham radio route where you actually require a license to use it legally? There's essentially one option that's completely license free. That's called the FRS band. It stands for Family Radio Service. Instead of worrying about the acronyms, you can think of it as the blister pack radios. You walk into Walmart, somewhere in there they have a section with a plastic bubble pack with a couple or 4 radios in there. Those usually operate on FRS. You don't need any license. You don't need to worry about anything. You just kind of put the battery in and go. They give you 20 some odd channels. Again, they'll tell you on the blister pack it has up to 6 million mile range. That's in absolute ideal conditions. With those puppies, you're probably in normal conditions, maybe half a mile, quarter mile. And that's due to the fact that they have a limited transmit power, which is regulated and enforced by the government. Next step over from there is GMRS. That's what this radio is. This is a Samcom radio. I'll put links to all this stuff down the bottom, of course. What GMRS gets you is more transmit power. So you can go from half a watt to these are 5 watts. If you have a mobile station, which I'll put a little thing up in the ether for the video of the radio install I did in my F-150. That guy's 25 watts. So more power generally equals more range. There are some other considerations there that I won't get into, but you can kind of assume that you're going to get a little more range and power out of that 5 watt. What I like about these Samcom units in particular is they're a good combo of being fairly cheap and fairly high quality, I would say. And when I'm saying high quality, it feels well put together. The buttons have a nice clickety-clackety. It's got some element of water resistance. It feels good in your hand. Battery lasts a long time. I mentioned I took these on a scout trip. We were hiking for 2 days, had these suckers on for 10, 12 hours a day with relatively limited transmit, but they lasted the entire time and used about half their battery. So it's a nice, robust radio, and I think these are $40 or $50 a pop. They go on sale occasionally, and they have a nice selection of accessories. You can get, uses a standard Kenwood style plug, so you can get earpieces, all that. You can get a 6-port charger that lets you put 6 of these guys in and charge them up. The other thing I really like is they have essentially group feature, they call it, I think. Yeah, they call it a group feature, where it will monitor one channel and let you kind of talk on another channel as well. So you can set up a group channel. So when I transmit on there, I'm getting that point to multi-point effect where I'm talking to everyone. And then I can also be on a different channel. So, maybe you and I are on channel 4, and maybe our larger group of 10 people is on different channels. So when I transmit, you just hear me, I hit that group button, and we hear everyone. So you can imagine that might be good on like a skiing trip where maybe you're out with 10 people and you want to be able to talk to your immediate family as well as a larger group. Might be good in that backpacking scenario that I laid out, although I didn't actually test or use that just because I didn't think of it. The one thing that's a little bit goofy with these Samcom radios in particular, their channel numbering is different than the rest of the world, but you can get a programming cable and adjust that. The one quasi-negative to GMRS is it is a licensed frequency. So in the US, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, requires that you have a license. The nice thing about that license, it's relatively cheap. I think it was, I'll put in the comments a link to where you can apply for a license and the current pricing, because I frankly can't remember what it is since they've changed it a couple times. The qualification for that license is the ability to pull out your credit card and pay the fee. So, yes, maybe you can make an argument that you're having to pay the man to use a public resource that should already be owned by the people. Or you can make an argument that, hey, it's a $35, tax and suck it up, buttercup. So that's GMRS. This is where I would point probably the majority of people that are looking for basic two-way point-to-point and point-to-multipoint tactical communications. It's cheap, it's reliable, it's robust. Your kid totally breaks one of these things, $40, you've got a replacement. You do have some ability to customize it with that group feature and with the ability to reprogram the radios. You don't have to study radio. You don't have to be a radio nerd. Uses common accessories, has a removable antenna. So I would strongly advise you go towards these Samcoms if you're looking for tactical comms for skiing, for family stuff, for outdoor stuff, with the caveat that you do need that license. One license is good per family. So theoretically, if I'm going skiing with 3 other families, those 3 other families each need to buy their own license, and then we can all use these radios legally from an FCC perspective. If I give these radios to my wife and 3 kids and we're out in the woods using these for our activities, I'm covered by that one license. The next step in two-way radio that a lot of people consider is ham radio. It's officially called amateur radio. And basically what that is it's a set of radio frequencies that governments in various countries in the world have set aside for amateur use. And by amateur, that means not really the general public, but a subset of the general public. And that subset is defined by people that have taken a test to learn some basic radio science. So in order to operate this radio, this is called I guess it's commonly referred to as a dual band radio. It uses the VHF and UHF ham frequencies. If you don't know what that means, don't really worry about it. But essentially, they have stages of licenses, and this is the lowest stage. It's called a technician class license. You have to learn some physics about radio propagation. You have to learn some rules around operating a radio. And it's frankly pretty good knowledge. There's some basic electronics stuff in there. There's kind of how to read basic electronics diagrams. If you find that stuff interesting and attractive, it's a worthwhile test to do just for your own knowledge. If you're into kind of disaster preparedness or something, learning how to build a basic transformer, kind of learning the basics of how radio works, learning how radio waves propagate and why, certain frequencies may give you 10 miles of range one day and 200 yards in a different situation is all useful and wonderful information. But it's not something that I think a normal human could just pass out of the gate. I tried taking a sample test, and I'm probably relatively technically savvy and have a relatively large basket of esoteric knowledge, and I couldn't pass it just with kind of my rote knowledge. So you got to study for it. It's not hard. There's all kinds of free stuff out on the interwebs that will help you study for your ham license. It's pretty cheap. I think it's $15 or something like that for a 5-year license. Once you pass your test, you get a call sign, you get to use these cool radios. So the benefit there is you get access to more frequencies. These radios do a lot more cool stuff, which I will talk about in some other videos, but you can see there's a nice fancy display on here that does all kinds of things. I can send rudimentary text messages. This radio has a GPS built in and I can send my position, all sorts of neat things. The challenge is everyone that operates one of these radios needs an amateur radio license. So if I'm going out with my family of 5, which includes a 5-year-old, all of us need a license to be able to operate the radio independently. Now you can sit with your 5-year-old and you can go through the rigmarole and the procedures of transmitting on the amateur bands and then hand it to your 5-year-old to talk to somebody somewhere else. But that 5-year-old can't then walk into the woods with his or her own amateur radio and speak to you. Even if you give them lessons and they're conscientious, wonderful, gifted, talented, blah, blah, blah human beings, they still need that license, which is probably going to be a bit of a challenge for anyone much under 7 or 8 years old that's not good at memorization, doesn't have that basic science background, and isn't willing to study for a relatively complex multiple choice test. So if you want to nerd out in the radio space and you want to gain some fairly valuable radio knowledge, or you happen to hang out with a bunch of other people that are licensed amateur radio operators, not a bad route. And when I say hang out with a group of other amateur radio operators, maybe you're in a Jeep or off-road vehicle group where, conditions of being part of that group are getting your ham license. Super cool. Great for tactical comms. You get some more options in terms of having both VHF and UHF. That's beneficial because they have different propagation characteristics that I won't bore you with, but that's a fancy way of saying they work better in different environments. So one works well in buildings and whatnot, one works better in open terrain. You get access to some of those cool things like the messaging and the positional exchange. You also get access to what's called a repeater. So that's that infrastructure I talked about before. So think of a repeater as a big giant antenna sitting somewhere that sucks in transmissions on one frequency and spits them out in another frequency. Why that's interesting is when it spits it out, it applies a whole bunch more power to it. So my little 5-watt buddy here, if I can hit a repeater that's up on a mountain, I can speak my piece and it's going to retransmit what I just said at 50 watts. And now my 1 or 2 mile range could be 25 to 150, maybe 200 miles. Some of those repeaters are even connected to the internet, so I could talk to somebody in another country via this little guy. So there's some interesting applications. You'll learn all about that stuff if you take your amateur radio test. That might be applicable to your tactical comms, but again, now you're starting to depend on infrastructure. You do, with your amateur license, get the ability to set up your own repeater. So if you're, maybe creating some tricked out RV or some tricked out van life type vehicle, you could have a repeater in that. You could have everyone with their own handhelds and do all sorts of cool stuff. You can do some of that with GMRS. GMRS does have repeaters available. To access them on this guy, you have to do a little fancy footwork on the keypad or do some programming. So it gets a little more complex, and I think it's a little more unusual in GMRS than it is in amateur radio. Amateur repeaters are just sort of par for the course. So there's capabilities in this radio that make it relatively easy to hit those repeaters versus having to do some programming or additional setup on the GMRS. The other thing I will say about amateur radio is it's a community that's very protective. In some cases, that's quite reasonable. Radio waves are a very valuable resource. They're not making more radio spectrum. You'll learn about some of that if you take the amateur radio test, but it's just like a rainbow. There's only so many colors in the rainbow. That's an example of visible light spectrum. Only so many, radio frequencies and kind of the rainbow of radio, and the government set aside a bunch for amateur radio people to play with. A bunch of companies, from cell phone companies to TV companies to, the military, would love to take over those frequencies and do all their own thing on it. But, amateur people, by virtue of having that license, get to play with a pretty valuable public resource. So if you pick up one of these radios, anyone can buy one of these over the internet. Anyone could buy the Baofeng, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, and you can get on there and start running your yapper. the amateur radio people are going to come down pretty hard on you. You know, if you go and post on the internet like, hey, I just bought a Baofeng and, you know, want to transmit on such and such, and the man's not going to tell me what to do about using a public resource, they're going to be a little bit snarky. And that's the reason why. You know, a lot of the older folks have had to fight to preserve that resource. There's a bunch of people that would like to take it away. So, you know, if you come across as trying to take advantage of that process, you will get some pretty, you'll get the proverbial stink eye from the ham radio community by virtue of that fact. If you come in and say, hey, I'm trying to get into this, you know, and ask questions in a respectful and kind manner, you usually get pretty good help. Most geographies have a ham radio club where they will help you get started. They'll, you know, let you play with their radios and kind of guide you. And they're the folks that are usually proctoring and executing the local amateur radio tests. So not bad folks to get to know if you want to get involved in that community. So the final word, if you spend like 6 seconds Googling, you know, radios or tactical radios or whatnot, inevitably you'll come to the Baofeng. And I had a Baofeng. It's essentially a super cheap programmable radio that comes out of China, where all, you know, wonderful, super cheap electronic goodies come from. It will transmit on basically any frequency. So you can get on there and you can transmit on the frequencies that airplanes flying over you are using. You can get on there and transmit on public safety frequencies, so what your police, fire, and EMS are using. You can get on there and transmit on military frequencies, and you will probably meet some new friends when you start to do that. And the nice thing about the Baofeng, and the reason everyone loves it, is it's super cheap, does a lot of stuff. You know, it's relatively programmable. They were relatively ubiquitous, although I think the FCC has cracked down a bit on the importation of those radios. The negative is they're cheap. They're not very well put together. I had one that broke after about 6 months of use. The other negative is it's pretty easy to get yourself in trouble. You know, you can end up on a frequency you're not supposed to be on, either through willful malfeasance or just through negligence. And, you know, you start transmitting to your kids and telling them to come inside for their chicken nuggets, and you're on the police frequency or you're on a military frequency, people are going to come knocking at your door. And it's not all that complex to track down the source of radio emissions, especially if they're on a frequency that's a public safety type of frequency. So I would frankly avoid the Baofeng. Where it might be useful, and there's some better options, is if you do go and get your amateur radio license. It's a cheap way to get started, but there's better cheap ways to get started, whether it's used gear or there's kind of a new generation of radios that are a little bit better put together and, you know, kind of force you to know what you're doing a little more than the Baofeng. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good overview of getting started with tactical communications. Again, highly recommend these Samcoms. They're a good price. They're a good radio. They're pretty robust. I've had a couple or three. You know, I've had the Motorola FRS radios, which the batteries on those universally suck. They're not great for the price you pay for them. I've had some nice Kenwoods that I don't think they make anymore, but yeah, these guys are a good combo of cheap and robust. If you don't want to go with something that's kind of an unknown brand and, you know, maybe a little squirrely in terms of support and whatnot, I like the Midlands quite a bit. I have a Midland GMRS radio in my truck. I'll put a link to both those guys down there if that's more your speed. And hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this helps you get your own tactical comms sorted. And hopefully you will enjoy and use the radio waves responsibly. And I will wish you well and say, this is the Big Heavy saying peace.
Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.